Some wounds are made in silence, but the cruelest ones are always meant to be seen. By the time the first snow began to fall over White Hollow Valley, every candle in Rose Fen House had already been lit, trembling against the tall windows as if even the flames understood what kind of evening had arrived. The winter bride selection was not called a ball, though the women dressed for it as if a crown were waiting at the end of the room. It was older than vanity and colder than romance, a private gathering of families who still believed marriage could rescue estates, erase debts, and turn daughters into bargaining pieces wrapped in silk. Outside, the Vermont hills lay beneath 12 inches of snow, white and merciless beneath the black December sky. Inside, beneath garlands of winter roses and silver ribbon, Miss Eliza Hartwell stood half hidden behind her two stepsisters, wearing a pale dress that had once been a curtain in the west parlor. Marjorie Hartwell glittered in ivory satin, her blonde curls pinned with pearls. Cecily Hartwell wore blue silk and a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Between them, Eliza looked almost invisible, except for the quiet steadiness in her face, and the tired grace with which she held her shoulders straight. Mrs. Rowena Hartwell had placed her there deliberately, close enough to be useful, far enough to be forgotten. "Do not speak unless spoken to," Rowena murmured without looking at her. "And for heaven's sake, do not embarrass us tonight." Eliza lowered her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." The words cost her nothing. She had learned long ago that obedience, when spoken softly enough, could protect the last private room inside a person's soul. Across the hall, the guests gathered in expectant clusters, whispering the name that had drawn them through the storm, Duke Callum Vane of Vainford Manor. Some said he had not smiled in 4 years. Others said his first betrothal had ended in a fire no one dared discuss. Mothers adjusted their daughters' gloves. Fathers measured dowries in their heads. Young women practiced modest expressions beneath the chandeliers. Then the house steward struck the floor once with his staff, and the room hushed. The bride candidates were to serve tea, one by one, according to the old custom of Rose Fen House, proving grace, breeding, and steadiness of hand before the Duke made his choice. Marjorie went first, elegant and slow, her cup balanced perfectly. Cecily followed, dipping her lashes as if humility were another jewel she could wear. Then Rowena's fingers closed around Eliza's wrist, too tight to be mistaken for kindness. "You will carry the silver pot," she whispered. "Do not drop it." The silver teapot was heavy, its handle wrapped in a white cloth already damp with steam. Eliza felt the heat through the fabric, but she stepped forward without complaint. The Duke had not yet entered the room. Still, every eye seemed to find her. A poor relation. A leftover daughter. The girl no one had invited, but everyone was permitted to judge. She reached the center table. Cecily drifted beside her with a soft little gasp. "Careful, Eliza! You always were clumsy." Marjorie's elbow moved only an inch. It was enough. The loosened handle slipped. The teapot tilted. Scalding tea spilled across Eliza's bare hands in a bright, terrible rush of heat. A sound rose from the room, half shock, half delight disguised as concern. Eliza's breath caught, but she did not cry out. Her fingers shook. Redness bloomed over her skin. The teacup struck the floor and broke into white pieces near her shoes. "Eliza!" Rowena cried, loud enough for everyone to hear. "How could you be so careless before His Grace's arrival?" Laughter flickered at the edges of the room, small and polished and cruel. Cecily covered her mouth with her glove. Marjorie looked down at the shattered cup as if it were proof of some lifelong truth. "She should never have been allowed in the selection," someone whispered. Eliza bent slowly, hiding her injured hands in the folds of her skirt before anyone could see them tremble. The room blurred with candlelight, perfume, and humiliation. She knelt to gather the broken porcelain because no one else moved, because servants were watching, because Rowena expected it, because dignity was sometimes nothing more than refusing to collapse when others had arranged the floor beneath you. Her fingertips hovered above the sharpest piece. Then a black-gloved hand reached down and picked it up first. The laughter died. Eliza looked up. A tall man stood before her in a dark coat dusted with snow, his grey eyes fixed not on the broken cup, not on her old dress, not on the scandal gathering around them, but on the hands she was trying so hard to hide. Duke Callum Vane had arrived without announcement, and by the silence that followed him, it was clear he had seen enough. The room had become so quiet that Eliza could hear the faint hiss of melted snow falling from the Duke's coat onto the polished floor. Duke Callum Vane held the broken piece of porcelain between two black-gloved fingers, studying it for only a moment before placing it on the table with a care that made the gesture feel like judgment. No one spoke. Even the musicians in the corner had gone still, their bows hovering above strings that no longer dared to sing. Eliza remained on her knees, one hand tucked beneath the other, the heat from the spilled tea still pulsing through her skin. She wanted to rise, but Rowena's eyes were upon her, hard and warning, and years of training held Eliza in place more firmly than any hand could have done. "Your Grace?" Rowena said at last, sweeping forward with a curtsy so practiced it seemed carved from marble. "Forgive this unfortunate disturbance. My stepdaughter has always possessed a generous heart, but very little refinement. I assure you, she was not meant to be presented." A few ladies exhaled softly, relieved that someone had given them permission to look down on the girl without appearing unkind. Marjorie lowered her lashes with a sorrowful expression. Cecily sighed as though embarrassed on behalf of the entire household. Callum did not look at any of them. His gaze remained on Eliza. "Stan," he said. The word was not loud, but it moved through the room like a door opening in a locked house. Eliza gathered herself carefully, refusing the small gasp that rose in her throat when her hands shifted against the fabric of her skirt. She stood with her chin lowered, her shoulders straight, and the broken cup glittering in pieces at her feet. "Show me." "Your hands," the Duke said. Rowena's smile tightened. "That will not be necessary, Your Grace. It was only a little tea. The girl is dramatic by nature, though she hides it cleverly." "I did not ask you," Callum replied. The coldness in his voice swept across the room more sharply than the wind beyond the windows. Rowena fell silent. Eliza slowly drew her hands from her skirt. The candlelight revealed what she had tried to spare them from seeing: reddened skin, trembling fingers, and the delicate restraint of a girl who had chosen silence because crying would have pleased too many people. A murmur stirred among the guests, but it was different now, less amused, less certain. Callum's jaw tightened. "Does it hurt?" he asked. Eliza felt every eye upon her, waiting to see whether she would beg for pity, accuse her stepsisters, or collapse into tears. Instead, she looked at the floor and answered honestly. "Not more than I can bear, Your Grace." Something flickered in his expression, gone almost before it could be named. "That was not my question." Eliza lifted her eyes. His face was stern, severe, almost unreadable, but there was no mockery in it. That alone unsettled her more than cruelty would have done. "Yes," she whispered. "It hurts." The admission passed through the hall like a candle being lit in a chapel. For years, pain had been something Eliza folded away, tucked under mattresses, hidden beneath gloves, swallowed before breakfast, carried through chores, prayers, and winter evenings when the house grew cold. To say it aloud before strangers felt almost improper. Almost dangerous. Marjorie stepped forward quickly. "Your Grace, my sister startles easily. She must have moved the pot the wrong way. She often does not understand how to behave in refined company." Cecily added, soft as lace and twice as false. "We tried to guide her, truly we did." Eliza said nothing. She saw the loosened handle in her mind. She felt the nudge. She heard the small, satisfied breath Cecily had taken when the tea fell. But she had learned that truth, when spoken by the powerless, was often renamed bitterness. Callum turned then, and for the first time looked directly at the stepsisters. "How fortunate Miss Hartwell is," he said, "to have such devoted instructors." Cecily's smile faltered. Marjorie flushed, uncertain whether she had been praised or exposed. The Duke removed one glove, then the other, and handed them to the steward beside him. His bare hands were pale, steady, and marked by a thin old scar across one knuckle. From his inner pocket he drew a folded white handkerchief embroidered with the Vane crest in black thread. He took one step closer. "May I?" Eliza's breath caught. No gentleman had ever asked permission to touch what others had treated as theirs to command. She nodded once. Callum wrapped the handkerchief loosely around her injured hands, careful not to press too hard. The touch was practical, restrained, almost formal, yet the whole room seemed to understand that something irreversible had occurred. Rowena's face hardened beneath her powder. Around them, the bride candidates stood in silk and pearls, suddenly less bright than they had been moments before. Callum looked at Eliza's bound hands, then at the broken cup, then at the waiting room. "A selection is meant to reveal character," he said. "Tonight it has." No one moved. Snow tapped softly against the windows as if asking to be let in. Eliza stood before him with the Duke's handkerchief around her hands and shame still burning in her cheeks, yet for the first time in Rosefen House, the silence surrounding her did not belong to cruelty. It belonged to judgment. For one suspended moment, no one inside Rosefen House seemed willing to breathe. The Duke's words remained in the air, colder than the snow against the windows and heavier than the silver chandeliers above them. "A selection is meant to reveal character. Tonight it has." Eliza felt the sentence settle around her like a cloak she had not earned and yet desperately needed. Her hands throbbed beneath the white handkerchief, but the pain had changed shape. It no longer belonged only to her. It had been seen. That alone made the room feel unfamiliar. Rowena recovered first, as she always did when danger threatened her performance. "Your Grace is most perceptive," she said, her voice smooth, though a faint strain trembled beneath it. "And surely you can see that a proper duchess must possess more than endurance. My daughter Marjorie has been trained in music, French, household management, and every social grace required of your station. Cecily, too, has a gift for conversation and charm. Eliza is dear to us, of course, but she has never been prepared for such elevation." Marjorie stepped forward at once, her satin skirts whispering across the floor. "I would be honored to pour for you again, Your Grace," she said, her smile bright and anxious. "Without disturbance." Cecily followed, softer, sweeter, poisonous only to those who had learned the taste of her kindness. "We only wish the evening to continue as intended." Eliza lowered her bound hands and moved a step back, but Callum's voice stopped her. "Remain where you are, Miss Hartwell." The use of her name caused another ripple among the guests. Not girl. Not stepdaughter. Not servant. Miss Hartwell. It was a small restoration, but Eliza felt it strike through years of dust. Callum turned to the long table where the remaining teacups waited untouched. "I did not come to White Hollow Valley to purchase silk, embroidery, or rehearsed obedience," he said. "I came to choose a wife." A nervous laugh escaped one elderly hand near the fireplace, then died quickly when no one joined it. Rowena's fingers tightened over her fan. "Naturally, Your Grace. That is why we have gathered the finest young ladies in the county." "No," Callum said. "You have gathered the most polished." His gray eyes moved over the room, over jeweled throats, powdered cheeks, lowered lashes, and fathers pretending not to calculate advantage. "There is a difference." Eliza wished she could disappear. To be mocked was familiar. To be defended was terrifying. It placed her in the center of a room that had never allowed her to stand there without punishment. Callum looked back at her. "Miss Hartwell, who prepared the winter roses in this hall?" She blinked. "I did, Your Grace." Rowena's head snapped toward her. "With guidance," she interjected. "From the household." Callum ignored her. "Who keeps the accounts for Rosefen House?" Eliza hesitated, and that hesitation answered more than words. "I assist with them." "Who arranged lodging for the servants of your guests tonight, when the roads became unsafe?" "I only spoke to Mrs. Vale and made certain the east rooms were warmed." "Who noticed the lower bridge was icing over and sent men to sand it before the carriages arrived?" Eliza's face grew pale. "That was nothing. It may have prevented an accident." The room shifted. What had been invisible labor became, under his questioning, a quiet ledger of worth. The women who had laughed now looked uncertain. The men who had dismissed Eliza as a poor relation began to study her as if she were a document they had failed to read. Marjorie's cheeks flushed with anger. "Those are servant matters." Callum turned to her. "A duchess who cannot understand servant matters will one day fail an entire estate." Cecily's mouth parted then closed. Rowena's fan snapped shut. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular. So was allowing an injured woman to kneel among broken porcelain." The words landed softly, but no one mistook their force. Eliza felt the blood rise in her face. She had not asked him to say it. She would never have dared. Yet some hidden part of her, the part that had swept ashes before dawn and written accounts by candlelight until her eyes blurred, stood straighter beneath the sound of it. Callum stepped to the center of the hall. "The selection is concluded." A gasp moved through the room like wind through bare branches. Rowena went still. Marjorie's smile vanished completely. Cecily looked at Eliza as if she had stolen the moon. Callum extended his hand, not touching Eliza this time, only offering the choice of it. "Miss Eliza Hartwell is the woman I choose." No music followed. No applause dared begin. The candles shivered. Outside, the storm pressed its white face to the glass. Eliza stared at the Duke's hand, then at his eyes, searching for mockery, pity, obligation, anything she could understand. She found none of them. Only a grave certainty, cold and sheltering at once. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I am not what they expected." Callum's expression did not soften, but his voice lowered enough that only the nearest guests could hear. "Neither am I." Eliza placed her bandaged hands carefully in his offered palm, and the hall that had gathered to witness her shame was forced to witness her choosing. By midnight the storm had sealed Rosefen House from the rest of White Hollow Valley, turning the road beyond the iron gates into a pale, unbroken ribbon of snow. The guests remained under Rowena Hartwell's roof because the weather gave them no civilized choice, yet no amount of firelight could warm the mood inside the old house after Duke Callum Vane chose the one woman no one had thought worth choosing. Eliza was sent to the small morning room while the physician examined her hands. She sat beneath a faded painting of her father's orchard, the Vane handkerchief still folded on the table beside her like evidence from a dream. The doctor spoke gently, wrapped her burns with clean linen, and told her she must not carry trays, polished silver, or place her hands in cold water for several days. Eliza almost smiled at the impossibility of it. At Rosefen House, pain had never excused duty. It had only made duty quieter. When the doctor left, she remained alone with the storm tapping against the windows and memory rising from the floorboards. Rosefen had not always felt like a house waiting to accuse her. When Eliza was a child, her father, Thomas Hartwell, kept the west garden alive with winter roses and taught her the names of every seed in the glasshouse. He had been a careful man, not wealthy in the way of dukes, but honorable, patient, and fond of saying that a house was measured not by its chandeliers, but by whether the lowest servant slept warm. After her mother died, he had tried to fill the silence with books, music, and long walks along the frozen creek. Then he married Rowena, believing kindness could be recognized by manners. Within 2 years Thomas was gone, taken by a fever that swept through the valley before Easter. By summer, Eliza's bedroom had been given to Cecily because it had better morning light. By fall, Eliza's piano had been sold to pay for Marjorie's wardrobe. By winter, the servants stopped calling her Miss Eliza unless Rowena was not near enough to hear. Nothing changed all at once. That was how cruelty became a household custom. A ribbon misplaced. A meal forgotten. A dress altered until it no longer belonged to her. A ledger placed before her because Rowena disliked numbers. A coal scuttle lifted because Cecily's wrists were too delicate. Eliza had not been thrown from her home. She had been slowly moved to the edges of it, inch by inch, until even she nearly forgot she had once stood at the center. Her hands carried the record. Tiny pale marks from sewing late into winter nights. Roughness from washing linens when the pump water came up sharp as ice. Faint scratches from pruning roses Marjorie later claimed to have arranged. Those hands had mended gowns, copied accounts, warm soup for sick maids, and written letters Rowena signed as her own. They had done nearly everything except receive tenderness. On the desk beside the window lay her father's old account book, its brown leather cover cracked at the spine. Eliza had hidden it behind loose paneling for years, not because she understood all of it, but because it was the last thing in Rosefen House that still seemed to know her true name. Thomas Hartwell had kept strange notes in the margins, not merely numbers, but initials, dates, payments, and symbols he had once called a private habit of order. Eliza had learned to read them while sitting at his knee. One set of entries had always troubled her, a payment marked with a black rose, made 4 years earlier to a man connected to a greenhouse on the Vane estate. She had never known what it meant. She only knew that after her father discovered it, he became watchful, then ill, then gone. The door opened before she could close the book. Rowena stood there in a dark green gown, her face no longer arranged for society. Behind her, Marjorie and Cecily hovered like pale reflections of the same resentment. "You must be very pleased with yourself," Rowena said softly. Eliza rose at once, tucking her bandaged hands against her waist. "No, ma'am. Do not play humble with me. You stood there with those wounded eyes and let him pity you." Cecily's mouth tightened. "He was supposed to choose one of us." Marjorie stepped closer, her voice low and shaking. "You ruined everything." Eliza looked from one face to another and felt, not triumph, but a tired sorrow. They still believed the Duke's choice had been a prize stolen from them, not a door opened before a woman who had spent years locked inside her own life. Rowena's gaze dropped to the account book. For the first time that night, true fear crossed her face before she covered it with anger. "Where did you find that?" Eliza's heart slowed. "It was father's." Rowena moved toward the desk. "It is old household rubbish." Eliza placed herself between Rowena and the book, though her hands trembled beneath their bandages. The storm pressed against the glass. Somewhere in the hall, a clock struck 12. In that small room, Eliza understood that the burns on her hands were not the beginning of the story. They were only the first wound powerful enough to make someone look. Rowena's hand stopped inches from the old account book, not because Eliza had strength enough to prevent her, but because the door behind them opened again. Duke Callum Vane stood on the threshold with Mr. Alden Pike at his side, the hallway candlelight resting along the hard line of his coat. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "step away from Miss Hartwell's property." Rowena turned with a smile that arrived too late to seem natural. "Your Grace, you misunderstand. The child is upset, and I only meant to spare her from troubling herself with old estate papers. She is not a child." The sentence was quiet, final, and impossible to soften. Marjorie looked down. Cecily's eyes moved toward the book, bright with alarm. Eliza stood motionless, one shoulder against the desk, her bandaged hands held close to her as if even the air might accuse them of reaching beyond their place. Callum looked at the linen wrapped around her fingers, then at the 3 women surrounding her, and something in his expression became colder than the storm. "Mr. Pike will keep the book safe until morning," he said. "Miss Hartwell will retire to a room with a proper fire, and the physician's instructions will be followed." Rowena's lips parted. "This is still my house. For tonight." No one understood the full meaning of those 2 words, but they fell heavily enough to silence the room. Mr. Pike crossed the floor, bowed to Eliza, and waited until she gave a small nod before taking the account book. That courtesy nearly undid her. For years, every object connected to her father had been removed, sold, or renamed as household property. To be asked, even silently, whether she consented felt like being restored by a gesture too small for anyone else to notice. Callum turned toward the hall. "Come, Miss Hartwell." Eliza followed, though each step away from Rowena felt like crossing a line drawn long before she was born. The house seemed to watch her pass. Portraits of Hartwell ancestors looked down from their dark frames. Silver branches of candlelight trembled along the walls. At the foot of the staircase, Marjorie's voice broke the silence behind her. "You cannot possibly mean to marry her." Callum paused, not turning. I do not make declarations for entertainment. She has nothing, Cecily said, the words thin with panic. Then Callum looked back. That is what interests me. A woman with nothing has still managed to possess more dignity than everyone who tried to take it from her. No one spoke after that. By morning, the storm had eased enough for travel, though snow still lay deep over the fields, nearly 2 feet in the low places where the wind had piled it against the fences. A black vane carriage waited before Rosefen House, its lanterns burning gold in the grey dawn. Eliza descended the steps in a borrowed cloak, carrying one small trunk that held less than most ladies packed for a weekend visit. A worn Bible. 2 plain dresses. Her mother's comb. A packet of letters from her father. Nothing else remained truly hers. The servants lined the entry in silence, not because Rowena had ordered it, but because they had chosen to come. Mrs. Vale, the housekeeper, pressed a small jar of lavender salve into Eliza's wrapped hands and looked away quickly. For the healing, Mississippi. Eliza's throat tightened. Thank you. Callum stood beside the carriage, formal and unreadable, his hat in one hand. He did not offer pretty comfort. He did not say the future would be kind. Perhaps he knew such promises were too easily made and too often broken. Instead, he opened the carriage door himself. Vainford Manor is 12 miles north, he said. The road climbs after White Hollow Bridge. It will be cold. Eliza looked up at the hills beyond Rosefen, where the dark line of pine trees cut into the winter sky. I am accustomed to cold, Your Grace. His gaze shifted to her hands. Then we shall begin by changing that. The words were simple, almost severe, yet they followed her into the carriage more warmly than any blanket. As the wheels began to turn, Rosefen House receded behind her, its windows pale and watchful, its chimneys breathing smoke into the morning. Eliza did not wave. She could not. Her hands ached beneath the linen, and some part of her still feared that if she looked too long, the house would call her back by all the names it had given her: burden, servant, mistake, nothing. Across from her, Callum sat in silence, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. Between them lay the distance of rank grief, suspicion, and one impossible choice made before a room full of witnesses. Yet when the carriage jolted over a frozen rut, and Eliza drew in a small breath, Callum reached to adjust the lap blanket over her knees without a word. Not tenderly. Not possessively. Carefully. Vainford Manor appeared near noon, rising from the mountainside like a thought carved in stone. Its great towers overlooked White Hollow Valley, and behind its iron gates stood black pines heavy with snow. Most of the windows were dark. One wing was shuttered completely. On the east side, half hidden beneath frost and climbing vines, Eliza saw the outline of a glass greenhouse with its doors chained shut. Callum saw her notice it. His face changed almost imperceptibly. That building is not used, he said. Eliza turned from the window, but not before she saw, through the frosted glass, the faint shape of withered roses still standing where no winter should have reached them. The carriage stopped. The great doors opened. Warmth spilled out, along with the scent of cedarwood, old stone, and a house that had forgotten how to welcome anyone. Callum stepped down first and offered his hand. Eliza hesitated only a moment before accepting it. This time, when she crossed the threshold, no one told her to lower her eyes. The first evening at Vainford Manor passed with the strange quiet of a house that had learned to breathe softly around grief. Eliza was given the south guest room, a chamber larger than her old bedroom at Rosefen House had ever been, with blue-gray walls, a carved walnut bed, and a fireplace already burning when she entered. Someone had placed fresh linen beside the washstand, warmed bricks beneath the coverlet, and a small silver bell within reach of her unsteady hands. It should have comforted her. Instead, the kindness made her cautious. Cruelty had always announced its terms clearly. Care was harder to trust. A maid named Nora helped remove Eliza's cloak and glanced at the bandages with gentle concern but no curiosity. His Grace ordered the physician's salve to be brought up every 4 hours, miss, she said. And no cold water. He was quite firm about that. Eliza looked toward the fire. His grace is often firm, I imagine. Nora's mouth twitched as though she almost smiled. Yes, miss. But not often wrong. After the maid left, Eliza sat beside the hearth with her father's letters in her lap and listened to Vainford settle around her. Pipes clicked in the walls. Wind moved across the roof. Somewhere far below, a door closed with a sound too heavy for an ordinary room. She thought of the greenhouse she had seen through the carriage window, its frosted panes and chained doors, the withered roses standing like witnesses behind the glass. By every sensible rule, she should have slept. Her hands ached beneath fresh linen. Her body felt hollow with exhaustion. Yet near 10 o'clock, when the manor had gone still and the hall outside her room lay in a blue wash of moonlight, Eliza found herself rising. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the corridor. Vainford by night was a place of long shadows and guarded portraits. The floorboards did not creak beneath her slippers, as if even the wood had been trained in discretion. She followed a faint draught down the rear staircase, past the gallery where painted vain ancestors stared from gilded frames, past the dark entrance to the shuttered east wing, and finally to a narrow glass door half hidden behind a velvet curtain. Beyond it, snows silvered the courtyard. The greenhouse stood at the far end, locked beneath the winter moon. Duke Callum Vane was already there. He stood before the chained doors without a coat, his dark figure rigid against the white ground, one hand closed around something small. Eliza should have turned back. Instead, the cold and the silence held her. You will freeze out here, Callum said without looking around. She startled. I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I did not mean to intrude. That is what people usually say when they have already intruded. His voice was dry, but not cruel. Eliza drew her shawl tighter. Then I shall be honest. I saw the greenhouse from the carriage. I wondered why it was locked. For a long moment he said nothing. Snow drifted from a pine branch and fell soundlessly near the path. At last he opened his hand. In his palm lay a ring, blackened at the edge, its small stone dulled by heat and time. Because some rooms preserve what they should have released. Eliza looked at the ring, then at the glass walls clouded with frost. It belonged to someone you loved. His jaw tightened. Someone I was meant to marry. The wind stirred between them. Her name was Miss Adeline Mercer. 4 years ago, she came to Vainford for the spring engagement supper. After dinner, she went into the greenhouse alone. A lamp overturned. By the time they reached her, it was too late to save the life she had planned. He spoke carefully, without ornament, as if plainness could keep sorrow obedient. Eliza lowered her eyes. I am sorry. So was everyone. The bitterness in those words was quiet enough to wound only the speaker. They were sorry, and relieved, and eager for the story to become an accident. Accidents offend no one. They require no courage. Eliza felt the old account book in her memory like a weight beneath her hands. A black rose. A payment. A greenhouse. Her father's anxious face in the months before he died. Did you believe it was an accident? She asked. Callum turned then. Moonlight cut across his face, sharpening the severity others mistook for emptiness. No. The answer entered the cold between them and stayed there. Eliza's pulse moved slowly, heavily. My father kept notes, she said. In his account book. I did not understand them all, but there was a mark he used when a payment was meant to be hidden. A black rose. Callum became utterly still. Say that again. A black rose, Eliza whispered. And beside it, there was a reference to a greenhouse connected to the Vane estate. For the first time since she had met him, Duke Callum Vane looked less like a man made of stone than one struck beneath the ribs. He closed his fingers around the ring. Who else knows this? Mrs. Rowena saw the book tonight. She was afraid. The name passed over his face like a shadow crossing ice. From inside the greenhouse came the faint ticking of frozen glass settling in its frame. Callum looked back at the chained doors. Then your burned hands may have carried more truth into this house than all my inquiries in 4 years. Eliza swallowed. I did not come here to bring trouble. His gaze returned to her bandages, and his voice lowered. No, Miss Hartwell. Trouble was already here. You merely survived long enough to name it. By morning, the old account book lay open on the library table beneath 3 brass lamps, its cracked leather cover surrounded by papers, estate maps, and the grave silence of men who understood that ink could ruin what gossip had protected. Mr. Alden Pike stood at one end with his spectacles low on his nose, carefully copying the symbols Eliza remembered from childhood. Duke Callum Vane remained near the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, the blackened ring placed before him like a relic no one dared touch. Eliza sat across from the book with her bandaged hands folded in her lap, trying not to show how badly they ached. The physician had warned her that healing would take patience. She had almost laughed at that. Patience was the only skill life had ever allowed her to master. Here, Mr. Pike said at last, tapping one careful finger beside a faded entry. April 7th. A payment marked with the black rose. No recipient named, only the initials R. H. and a delivery note for White Hollow Bridge. Eliza looked at the page, and the years seemed to draw together like thread. R. H. could be Rowena Hartwell. It could, Callum said. His voice was controlled, but his eyes had darkened. It could also be coincidence. Eliza looked up, surprised. He met her gaze steadily. If I accuse her too soon, she will hide behind outrage. We need proof that cannot be dressed as misunderstanding. There was no dismissal in the words, only discipline. Eliza lowered her eyes again and studied the marks her father had left. Thomas Hartwell had never wasted ink. Every symbol had meaning. Every line leaned towards something he had wanted found if he could no longer speak. She turned a page awkwardly, wincing when the linen pulled against her skin. Callum saw it. Of course he did. Stop, he said. I can continue. No, Your Grace. The firmness in her own voice startled her. My father taught me the cipher. If the truth is here, I must be the one to read it. Mr. Pike looked to the Duke as if expecting objection. Callum gave none. That silence steadied her more than approval might have done. For the next hour, Eliza read fragments aloud. A shipment of lamp oil ordered under a false account. A payment to a stable hand who had left Vermont the next morning. A note about greenhouse keys copied without permission. Nothing complete. Nothing safe. Yet each piece moved the dead past closer to the living room. Near noon, a servant entered with a silver tray and a sealed note. From Rosefen House, Your Grace. Delivered by special rider. Callum broke the seal. As he read, his face changed not with surprise, but with recognition, as though he had expected cruelty to arrive dressed in stationery. Mrs. Hartwell requests an audience this evening, he said. She claims urgent concern regarding Miss Hartwell's character. Eliza felt the room tilt slightly. My character? Mr. Pike's mouth tightened. That is a familiar weapon among those who lack better evidence. Callum handed him the letter. She writes that certain household valuables disappeared before Miss Hartwell left Rosefen, including a pearl necklace belonging to Marjorie. Eliza went cold. I took nothing. I know. The answer came so quickly that it stole her breath. Callum looked at her across the table, his expression severe, his certainty absolute. But she is not writing to convince me. She is writing to create witnesses. Eliza understood then. Rowena did not need the lie to be elegant. She only needed it to be loud. By evening, Vainford Manor had been prepared not for hospitality, but for judgment. Fires burned in the receiving hall. The family solicitor was summoned from the village. 2 senior servants from Rosefen, Mrs. Vale and old Mr. Brant, arrived quietly by carriage, both pale with nerves and carrying statements Mr. Pike had requested before dawn. Eliza did not know how Callum had moved so quickly. She only knew that every silence in the house seemed to be sharpening itself. Shortly after 6 o'clock, Rowena arrived with Marjorie and Cecily, their gowns immaculate, their grief rehearsed. Marjorie carried a lace handkerchief to her eyes. Cecily clutched a small velvet case against her chest. Rowena swept into the hall as though she had been wronged by the architecture itself. "Your Grace," she said, "I come with the greatest sorrow." Callum stood before the fireplace, dark against the gold light. "Most people do, when they bring accusations." Rowena's smile flickered. "Then I shall be plain. Eliza stole from this family before leaving Rosefen House. I believe she has deceived you, as she deceived all of us with her quiet manner." Cecily opened the velvet case. It was empty. "My sister's pearls?" she whispered. "Gone." Eliza remained seated, her bandaged hands visible against her dark dress. She felt the old pull of shame, the instinct to lower her head before the lie had even finished forming. But then she saw the account book on the table. Her father's ink. Her father's warning. Her own hands, injured and still present. She lifted her chin. "When did you last see the pearls?" Rowena's eyes narrowed. "Do not question your elders." "Tonight," Eliza said softly. "I think I must." The hall changed around that sentence. Marjorie stopped pretending to cry. Cecily's fingers tightened around the empty case. Callum did not speak for her. He simply stood beside the fire and allowed her voice to occupy the room. For the first time in her life, Eliza understood that silence was not the same as surrender. Sometimes silence was only the breath before truth began. The question seemed to settle over Vainford Manor with more force than any accusation Rowena had brought through its doors. "When did you last see the pearls?" Eliza had asked it softly, without anger, but the receiving hall answered with silence. Marjorie's lace handkerchief paused beneath one dry eye. Cecily looked at the empty velvet case as though it had suddenly become heavier. Rowena recovered with practiced grace, lifting her chin until the candlelight sharpened the pearls at her own throat. "This is absurd," she said. "The accused does not conduct the inquiry." "No," Callum replied from beside the fire. "The truth does." His voice did not rise. It only removed escape. Mr. Pike stepped forward with a small leather folder in his hands, but Callum raised one finger, stopping him. He looked to Eliza instead. "Miss Hartwell, do you wish me to speak?" It was the same question he had asked her with his eyes in Rosefen House, when she knelt among broken porcelain, and everyone expected her pain to remain convenient. This time, he asked it aloud before the very people who had trained her to believe she owned no voice. Eliza felt her bandaged fingers curl lightly against her dress. The linen pulled. The ache steadied her. "No, Your Grace," she said. "Not yet." Rowena laughed once, a brittle sound. "You see what you have encouraged? Insolence dressed as courage." Eliza turned toward her stepmother. "Marjorie wore the pearls at supper 3 nights ago. Cecily asked to borrow them yesterday afternoon, but Marjorie refused because the clasp was loose. I know because I repaired the clasp last month after it snagged on her shawl." Marjorie's color changed. "That proves nothing. It proves I knew the necklace well enough to mend it, and if I meant to steal it, I would have known the clasp still needed care." Cecily lifted her eyes. "Clever words." "Not clever," Eliza said. "Remembered." Mrs. Vale, the housekeeper from Rosefen, stood near the sideboard with both hands folded at her waist. She looked as if every year of service weighed upon her shoulders. Callum glanced to her. "Mrs. Vale, you may speak freely in this house." The woman drew a shaking breath. "The pearl necklace was not missing when Miss Eliza departed, Your Grace. I saw it that morning on Miss Marjorie's dressing table while packing linens. I also saw Mrs. Hartwell's maid take it downstairs afterward." Rowena's face hardened. "A servant's confusion." "No, ma'am," Mrs. Vale whispered, then found strength in the sound of her own denial. "I have served Rosefen House for 29 years. I know what I saw." Mr. Brandt, the old footman, stepped forward next, hat clutched between his hands though he stood indoors. "Begging pardon, Your Grace, but there is more. The silver teapot at the selection had been examined that afternoon. The handle was sound. After Miss Cecily went near the serving table, the cloth around it was moved, and one screw was loosened. I did not understand why until the tea fell. Cecily gasped. That is a lie. Is it? Callum asked. He held out his hand. Mr. Pike opened the leather folder and removed a small screw wrapped in paper. Found beneath the serving table by one of the kitchen boys, Mr. Pike said. The physician has also confirmed the pattern of injury on Miss Hartwell's hands is consistent with a sudden spill from a shifted vessel, not ordinary clumsiness. Eliza heard the words as if from a distance. Injury. Vessel. Consistent. Language had made her pain official, respectable, impossible to laugh away. Marjorie stepped backward. Cecily's lips trembled, though whether from fear or fury, Eliza could not tell. Rowena's fan opened, then closed, then opened again. Even if some childish mischief occurred, she said, it does not alter what Eliza is. She was raised on charity. She is unfit to stand beside a duke. Eliza looked at the floor for one brief moment. There it was, the oldest accusation, stripped of jewels and manners. Not theft. Not deception. Unworthiness. The word had lived in Rosefen House longer than she had. Callum moved then, not quickly, but with the measured calm of a man ending a ceremony. He crossed the hall and stood beside Eliza, close enough that the firelight placed their shadows together upon the wall. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, you continue to mistake cruelty for breeding. It is a common error among those who own silver and lack honor. Rowena went pale. Your Grace. You came here to disgrace Miss Hartwell a second time. Instead, you have provided witnesses. Mr. Pike laid the old account book on the table and opened it to the marked page. The black rose stared up from the paper, small and faded, yet more powerful than every jewel in the room. Eliza touched the edge of the table with one wrapped hand. There are entries here, she said, her voice quiet but clear. Payments hidden under my father's cipher. One marked for the week before the greenhouse tragedy at Vainford. One bearing initials that match yours. I do not yet know the whole truth, Mrs. Hartwell. But I know why you were afraid of this book. The hall seemed to darken around Rowena, though the candles burned steadily. For the first time, she had no immediate answer. Outside, the wind moved over the snowfields and pressed softly against the windows. But inside Vainford Manor, the storm had changed direction. It no longer beat against Eliza. It gathered behind her. Rowena Hartwell stood before the open account book as if the small black rose on the page had become a door she could no longer close. For years she had trusted in distance, manners, and fear. She had trusted that servants would remain silent, that daughters would compete instead of question, that a quiet girl with wounded hands would never be believed before a woman dressed in green silk. But Vainford Manor was not Rosefen House, and Duke Callum Vane was not a man easily persuaded by polished lies. Mr. Pike placed one final paper beside the ledger, its seal cracked from age. Your Grace, this statement arrived from a retired stable hand in Burlington. He confirms he was paid to deliver a package to the Vane greenhouse 4 years ago, then leave Vermont before sunrise. The payment came through an intermediary connected to Mrs. Hartwell. The words did not shout. They did not need to. They crossed the hall with the quiet force of a church bell in winter. Marjorie sank into a chair, colorless beneath her carefully arranged curls. Cecily began to cry, not with sorrow, but with the terror of a world refusing to obey her. Rowena looked at them both, then at Eliza, and something like hatred passed through her face before pride covered it. You think this makes you noble? She said. You, with your mended dresses and servant hands? Eliza felt the old wound open, but this time it did not swallow her. She looked down at her bandages, at the hands Rowena had tried to make shameful, and found them strangely dear. No, she said. It only makes me free. Callum turned to the solicitor. Mrs. Hartwell will be removed from management of Rosefen House pending formal review of the estate and its accounts. Miss Marjorie and Miss Cecily will make written statements regarding the incident at this election. Until then, they will leave Vainford Manor. Rowena drew herself up. You cannot command my house. No, Callum said. But truth can. Mr. Pike signaled to the waiting footmen, and the matter ended not with spectacle, but with order. That was what made it worse for Rowena. No shouting. No grand collapse. Only doors opening, servants witnessing, papers collected, and power quietly leaving her hands. As she passed Eliza, Rowena paused. He will tire of pity. Eliza met her eyes. Then it is fortunate he did not choose me for pity. For the first time, Rowena looked away. When the doors closed behind the Hartwell women, Vainford Manor seemed to exhale. The candles steadied. The wind softened against the glass. In the silence that followed, Eliza realized she was trembling. Not from fear. From the strange exhaustion of having survived a life and only now understanding how heavy it had been. Callum dismissed the others with a nod, though Mr. Pike lingered long enough to gather the account book with the care of a sacred text. Then Eliza and the Duke were alone in the receiving hall, standing before the dying fire while dawn began to pale the far windows. Neither spoke at first. There were too many things between them now: a broken cup, a burned hand, a dead woman's ring, a father's cipher, a house reclaimed from lies. At last Callum took the blackened ring from the mantel. Adeline deserved truth, he said. So did your father. Eliza nodded. Then we will give it to them properly. The word we seemed to change the air. Callum looked at her, and the severity in his face softened into something quieter, more dangerous to a wounded heart than tenderness because it asked for trust. The choice I made at Rosefen was public, he said. But what comes next must be yours. If you wish to return to your father's house when the matter is settled, I will see it restored to you. If you wish to live elsewhere, I will arrange it. No vow will be built from gratitude. Eliza listened to the fire settle into embers. For so long, every road had been chosen for her, which room to sleep in, which dress to wear, which pain to hide, which silence to keep. Now freedom stood before her, not bright, not easy, but real. She looked at Callum's hand, then at his face. And if I wished to stay? She asked. His breath changed almost imperceptibly. Then stay because you are wanted, not because you are rescued. Eliza's eyes filled, though no tear fell. I do not know how to be wanted. Callum took one careful step closer. Neither do I. The confession was plain, stripped of pride, and in that moment Eliza understood that Vainford Manor had been waiting for more than justice. It had been waiting for life to enter without permission and refuse to leave. Spring came slowly to White Hollow Valley that year. The formal inquiry restored Rosefen House to Eliza's name, while Rowena's schemes were carried into courtrooms and county records where they could no longer hide behind perfume and silk. Marjorie and Cecily left Vermont to live with distant relatives, humbled more by obscurity than punishment. At Vainford, the locked greenhouse was opened on the first warm morning of April. Dead vines were cleared. Broken panes were replaced. Beneath the glass roof, Eliza planted winter roses with her healing hands, and Callum stood beside her, holding the watering can when her fingers tired. He never kissed her scars as if they needed erasing. He learned them as part of her history. Months later, in the same receiving hall where Eliza had once gathered, Eliza Hartwell became Duchess Vane before a small company of servants, neighbors, and friends who had witnessed enough sorrow to understand joy when it arrived quietly. Callum placed the ring on her finger with steady hands, not the blackened relic of the past, but a simple band engraved inside with words only she would read, chosen in truth. Outside, snow had long melted from the valley, and the creek below the manor ran bright beneath the sun. Eliza looked at the man beside her, and did not feel saved like a fragile thing carried from a storm. She felt seen, and seeing was the deeper miracle. Some hands are burned not because they are weak, but because they carried a light others were desperate to destroy.